I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is sort of the Chinese literature podcast.
We ordinarily do a podcast, but today we're live.
We're on video. We're in real time.
This will either gain or lose an audience for us.
I think it will mostly lose when they see
the people who've been listening to the podcast look at us.
We have faces made for podcast.
I would have to 100% agree.
So today we're going back to an old favorite.
We're going back to an old favorite of Lee's. Lee and I have an ongoing argument about the author we're talking about today, Zhang Ailing.
Zhang Ailing. That's
Because
Ailing Chang in English.
Ailing Chang, right,
Yeah.
in English. But Lee's on record is saying that Zhang Ailing is the greatest Chinese writer
in
of
the 20th century. Yes, I think so.
I enjoy her writings. I'm not going to go that far. And Lee and I have an ongoing battle because I really enjoy what they call May 4th literature.
The reason he says that is because he's wrong.
Is because I'm a snob, or possibly just because I have taste.
Whatever.
That could be that too.
Anyway, so we're looking specifically at a Zhang Ailing story that's very famous. It's oftentimes anthologized. It's called Sealed Off, or Feng Suo in Chinese. So can you give me a little bit of the background?
Well, it's published in 1943, and that's a really interesting period in Shanghai, which is where Zhang Ailing is writing, and a lot of her fiction takes place
And
in
it's
Shanghai.
also where the story takes place.
Right. From 1937 to 41, there was a war between the Second Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan, and the Japanese occupied Shanghai and essentially pushed everybody out except the foreign enclaves there right before 41. 1941 is the beginning of the Pacific War between the U.S. and Japan. This story is in 1943. And what's important about this for the context of this story is that a lot of refugees, Chinese refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe, basically all over, are flooding into the foreign sectors, the foreign quarters in Shanghai.
Yeah, Shanghai at this time is one of the largest cities in the world. I think it's maybe the fourth or fifth largest. It's just this huge entrepot.
Yeah, and it had always been very multicultural. It had always been a real blend, a melting pot, not just of Chinese and Japanese, but lots of other European countries. And it was arguably the most important business city in China.
It was definitely the most.
It was a metropolis. It's where everyone went to go if you wanted to be a part of sort of the modern world in China. And so she's writing in 43, which is right smack in the middle of World War II. So as you start a story like this, having already said it's very anthologized, it's written by a Chinese writer in Shanghai in World War II, you go into it with certain assumptions, right?
What are those assumptions?
Well, I mean, if you're just reading this for the first time, you have to assume, well, she's going to be writing about the horror of the Japanese occupation, the terror of the occupants and the inhabitants.
And it's interesting because a lot of other writers, not Zhang Ailing, but a lot of other writers from China at this time, most of them would be writing about the horrors of the war and the way that the Japanese mistreated the Chinese.
There's a real push in literature at the time in China against the Japanese, to write things to attack the Japanese in print.
Writing is essentially seen as a kind of social instrument. It's a tool. But Zhang Ailing says, no, she's going to write for aesthetic reasons. She's going to write something beautiful, to write something amazing. And I think she accomplishes that in this story.
This is something else Lee and I also disagree on. Lee always begins this as though Zhang Ailing writes only pure, beautiful literature, and all other people who have any kind of social conscience are just like, I'm not even going to try, I'm just going to write a political tract and move on. It wasn't quite that stark. But
mostly.
But you are correct that in this period there aren't many writers who are willing to put the war in the background. And I think this is important because she's got multiple stories like this.
Yeah.
You and I have talked also about one or two of her other stories.
Love in a Fallen City.
Love in a Fallen City particularly, which is about the bombing of Hong Kong
by the Japanese. And the funny thing about that story is the word Japan in Japanese isn't even mentioned anywhere in this story. You know, she just talks about the bombing as if it's integral to the story, but it doesn't really matter who did it.
She doesn't focus on it.
It's a love story.
And in fact, the first time I read the story we're going to talk about today, Sealed Off, I wasn't connecting the historical facts, and I was not even thinking when it was published, and it read like a city scene almost anywhere you can imagine.
It could really be in San Francisco at the
be.
exact same time, except for the fact that the story revolves around a tram car that stopped in the middle of a possible bombing raid by someone. It's not really clear who. The story itself, it starts, and it's actually really interesting because the narrator moves around. So we're jumping from like one person talking, we're inside one person's head, and then we're inside another person's head, and eventually we kind of land on these two people. One is Wu Cuiyan, and the other is Lu Zhongzhen. So Lu Zhongzhen is a middle-aged man who's not happy in his marriage, and he is reading the newspaper off of his buns?
Yeah, this is not a euphemism. He actually has buns.
He actually has buns
He's
wrapped in
them
the
in
newspaper. And he's reading the newspaper off of these buns, which he eventually eats.
And we should jump into this here because this will be a nice frame for people watching this. But Lee and I, we read the story and we talk about it. We always come back to the notion that this is a perfectly urban story, as in the story itself couldn't even work were it not in an urban setting like this. And that's an example. Everyone on the tram, which is stuck, which in and of itself is very urban.
It's strange because the whole activity of the city just seems to stop.
Right.
It feels, I mean, the narrator says, you know, it feels like time and space had come to an end or something like that. It's an incredibly odd moment. They're stuck there because there's this bombing raid, but and the city, the sealed off reference in the title is literally the city is closed off.
Right.
And they're not sure what's happening. But it's funny because just as the city is sealed off, it seems like everybody opens up and becomes human. And so there's this question of, is being and living in a modern city something that disconnects us from our humanness?
And what is wonderful about Zhang Ailing's fiction is that she doesn't entirely answer that question, because the tram car is what makes any of these connections in the story possible, but the fact that it's not working is what actually makes people interact, or read, for that matter. We talked about the one of the main characters who's reading the newspaper off of the rice bun that it's been imprinted on.
Right.
But other people are reading street signs or reading books if they brought them, or
to a certain degree,
hat label, some things like that.
To a certain degree, the whole story is about reading.
Right.
The other character, whose name is Wu Cuiyan, she is a young kind of college graduate. She's working as an English teacher in a local college, and she is grading papers. But she's also reading everybody on the tram car, and to a certain degree, this story is just about reading people.
Right.
You know this, and it's done in a very urban kind of way that I think the narrative is, to a certain degree, the form of the narrative is inspired by the tram car. It just feels like people are getting on and off of the story, not just on the tram car, but of the story itself. People kind of appear, disappear, reappear. It's just
the first half of the story is jarring because when you start a story inside someone's head, the expectation is you're going to stay there. And for the most part, fiction
and you're not
going to
know anything else about anyone else's head, what's going on in anyone else's head.
And that's true for fiction in this period as well. Most of it is, if it is very psychological, it's psychological in one person's mind, maybe two.
Yeah.
But in this one, she'll spend a paragraph or the narrator, I should say, the narrator spends a paragraph or two inside one person's head and moves to someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else, very much in the manner of someone who's just strolling through a crowd.
You mentioned when we were talking about this earlier, the idea of the flaneur.
When we talk about the French poet Baudelaire, there's a concept, actually I think it's by Walter Benjamin, the German critic writing about Baudelaire. He's the one that uses the actual term, but the notion is that in a modern city, only in a modern city, you have the ability to sort of roam anonymously. You can just sort of wander and observe and look, and things come into and out of your life temporarily. They're there and then they're gone forever. And a lot of Baudelaire's poems focus on a woman who's walking by, and he'll obsess about her, and then she's gone, right? And this story is very much that way too. You have an urban center like Shanghai, and people are speculating about who these others are around them, and the narrator in particular is just doing a little bit of strolling, sort of checking people out.
And it feels like it's a very both intimate and unintimate sort of checking them out, because we get into their deepest thoughts, their desires, when Wu Cuiyuan and Liu Zongzhen are talking, he actually proposes a marriage to her. Like he just meets on the car. They meet on the car, and he proposes that she become his concubine.
Right.
Sort of. It's an incredibly weird, incredibly awkward moment. And the narration actually says that they fell in love.
Yes.
It does actually say that. So we have this very deep exploration of desires. But for the most part, we don't actually know anything about any of these characters. You know, we start with the guy driving the tram, and the first sentence is, the tram driver was driving the tram.
It's a very redundant phrase.
It's incredibly redundant.
What else would a tram driver be driving? The tram driver is driving
He's driving his monster truck.
Monster truck,
yeah.
right, exactly.
No, but the tram driver is driving his truck, and we don't get any kind of like, any of his backstory.
No.
We learn what he's thinking or what he's feeling, the emotions that he's having at that particular moment, but we don't learn who he is, we don't learn anything about his backstory. And that happens to a certain degree with all characters,
right.
I would say including Wu Cuiyuan and Liu Zongzhen.
Yeah.
We get some of their backstory, but it's only when they tell us their backstory. So they'll reveal their backstory little by little in their thoughts or when they're talking to each other.
Right.
But we don't really, like, it's not an exposition. It's not like the narrator comes and says, okay, this is Wu Cuiyuan, she is this, and she has this kind of family. No, she just slowly reveals it through this very psychological...
Very much as though she's strolling through a crowd, but somehow, because of her status as a narrator, has the ability to actually see what people are... But even then, doesn't stay. She moves around anyway.
But she gets access to their desires.
And still moves around. And this is the aspect of the story that I find both the most interesting and for this era the most important, because to some extent the same things that are making urban life perhaps somewhat inhuman also make it human at the same time. She's not telling us which one is which here. So you have this mode of transportation that just smashes people together, and for the most part they ignore each other. However, it's also the only way this story happens, is that people are smashed on a tram.
But people are only smashed together, and people are smashed together all the time on a tram,
right.
But they only become people. They only relate to each other when the city stops.
Right. Or not so much even when it stops, but when it pauses.
Well, yeah. I mean, when it completely just pauses and stops working.
And I want to tie this into something we said earlier about the historical context and what Zhang Ailing often does with this. The modern tradition in China going into the 30s, at least the writers we usually see anthologized.
Which are who? Like
Lu Xun and Mao Dun and people of that stripe, Zhou Zuoren. There's a desire to use literature to actively form the way society functions.
Zhou Zuoren talks about ren de wenshui, like people literature.
What it is, how does it,
And it's the kind of like, it should be edifying. I think that's what Zhou Zuoren would say in kind of a modern...
Improving in that sort of old school, like 19th century, enlightening sort of sense.
But there's an interesting thing. So when Wu Cuiyuan is in this story, so Wu Cuiyuan, the heroine of this, I don't know if you can even call her a heroine, the main female character in this story, when she's actually like sitting around grading papers, she has this, paper she grades, she gives it an A, but it's absolutely hilarious because she's like, oh, he writes really poorly. I forget the Chinese, but it's just really kind of bad writing.
It is bad writing.
And he's like writing about how horrible the city is. And he does it in this very kind of like anti-feminist way. I mean, he's a guy who's talking about prostitutes and how horrible they are and how they're just kind of tempting people. And it's really, she's just kind of like,
So this is the phrase. This is the student's paper. Lipstick-wearing prostitutes, cruising the Cosmo, seedy bars and dance hall. And then he goes on to complain. And he says, SU, meaning I guess Shanghai University, is really falling apart, getting worse all the time. A Chinese person teaching us English is already bad enough. And this one's a Chinese who's
That's
never...
a reference to her.
I know, exactly. And this one's a Chinese who's never even been abroad.
What's fantastic about this, and I would say that this whole story, but particularly this part, and in fact all of Zhang Ailing's writing, is a critique of the May 4th literature movement in Chinese literature.
This very self-consciously serious approach.
We should define what May 4th literature is.
Not everyone's going to know. So in 1919, after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, the Shandong Peninsula gets handed to the Japanese. And predictably, the Chinese are not happy about this.
Right, and so it starts this whole movement, kind of nationalism, Chinese nationalism to a certain degree, all comes
national
out
waking up
of it. But specifically, it's a kind of literature that is very much informed by this nationalism from 1919, May 4th, 1919. She is saying, no, I don't really care about nationalism. I'm not concerned about that, like these guys who are constantly just spouting off about how horrible the city is and how terrible foreigners are. No, I don't care about that. I am just concerned about beauty. I'm concerned about aesthetics and beauty, and I think that's what this story is about. And that particular part that you read is a slight at the May 4th movement.
Although I'm not sure I see her writing, because when you say aesthetics, I think writing purely for the purpose of having beautiful verse, like the deployment of the language is beautiful. But what I see her here is more concerned with just the people around her. There's no real desire here, I don't think, to craft perfectly written Chinese.
I disagree. I think that for her, the interest in the people around her is also an interest in the beauty of writing. Because if you write poorly, if you write just like a lot of the May 4th writers wrote, and I'm going to say that controversially. I'm on tape now.
Controversially, you're on tape, and you're wrong, but go for it. Whatever you want.
But if you're writing, if you're not concerned about aesthetics and you're not concerned about writing well, then you're also not concerned about people.
Well,
hang on. Let me read the particular passage. So this is right before the passage we just read. So after graduating from college, Cui Yuan had become an English instructor at her alma mater. Now, with the city sealed off, she decided to make use of the time by grading a few papers. The first one was a male student's. It railed against the evils of the big city, full of righteous anger and the prose stiff, choppy, ungrammatical. She's clearly saying that bad writing is a bad problem.
Could be, but I think my point being simply that your dividing line is always Zhang Ailing is aesthetic, everyone else is social.
No.
But what I'm saying is,
I'm saying Shanghai writers are concerned about aesthetics, and they're concerned about people, and they're much better writers. They're much more concerned about good writing. Whereas May 4th,
I like that you've grouped the entire early 20th century into two camps, one of whom suck and the others don't. These are really subtle scholar. This is what I like about working with him. He's just so many shades of possibility here. I think my point in this would be not to have this division between everyone that we call May 4th, and let's be honest, a lot of what's called May 4th, like some of what Lu Xun writes, is not remotely what we usually think of as May 4th writing.
True.
Some of his prose poetry, for example, is so bizarre and experimental that it does not qualify.
But that fits much more with the Shanghaiese writers, and I think
Except that they're not writing in either Shanghaiese or in Shanghai or about Shanghai.
He was writing in Shanghai, I think, at the time.
Yecao?
Yeah.
Wild Grass, I don't think he was.
No? Okay.
No.
Anyways.
But where I was going to take this a little earlier, though, before you sidetracked me into your hero worship of Zhang Ailing, was there is a pushback against the May 4th here, but it is not necessarily, or at least not purely, aesthetic. One of the things that she does so brilliantly is she takes a slice of life, it's just people on a tram, and does not push it too far.
She dissects it.
She dissects it, and then she moves on, like a good city person would. You come, you observe, you think about it, you write about it, and then you keep going to where you were going.
She's the perfect flaneur.
I would say that. Yeah.
Would you say she's better than Baudelaire?
No, I would not say that. But she is a perfect urban writer in this case, and I think this is important to point out too, because a lot of what Chinese writers, some of the more famous ones anyway, writing right before and after her, were trying to do is sort of, I guess for lack of a better phrase, wake the people up. But a lot of the people that needed to be woken up were in the countryside.
Right.
You were at least nominally writing for the common people.
Right.
There's a lot of argument about whether that even means anything. But she's intentionally not. She's not interested because they're not her people. They are in the sense that they all have a similar language and cultural background, but these are her people, the people in the tram. And this poses an interesting problem about cities and the life in Shanghai in the 30s and 40s in particular, who are your people? I mean, there's foreign enclaves all over the city. You've got French sections, English sections, German sections, Japanese.
The police are mostly Sikh, Indian.
So what does someone in Shanghai mean when they say, my people?
Let me ask you something. This is a question that I asked my students when I was teaching this in a course.
So I'm your student now.
Essentially. But do you think that Wu Cuiyuan and Lu Zongzhen are Chinese?
Oh, wow.
The story actually does not fully offer us an answer. I mean, it's implied, obviously, that they are.
Because their names are Chinese.
Because their names are Chinese, and it makes a reference in the student's paper that he is being taught by an English
speaking Chinese
person, right? But there's nothing really that makes them necessarily Chinese. Like, you and I both have Chinese names. If you just took our names and replaced them in the story, this story, you mentioned it before, could occur anywhere.
Or could they be Singaporean, Malaysian? Could they be Chinese but born overseas? What does that even mean?
Yeah. And I think the point of this story is she's writing to a certain degree against the May 4th, and the May 4th is emphasizing we need an identity that is Chinese. We have to write our Chineseness. And I think the question that she's asking here, similar to the one that we discussed earlier in Shi Zhecun and the General's Head, is, does it even matter? Do we even need a national identity? Can't we just be people on a streetcar?
Or perhaps, and I would agree, but perhaps it's also a way of forecasting the future, a way of going, okay, well, let's say we do become a great modern nation. This is what it'll look like. It's not going to look like we're not going to be carrying
flags and talking about how Chinese we are every day.
Right. So she's operating on a different side of this question of what it means to be Chinese, because for her it's almost inconsequential. And
at least in the story.
At least in this story. There are other stories where it's a little different. Yeah. But in this story, in this moment on the tram car, what it means to be Chinese, what it means to be modern, what it means to interact, fall in love, all of these things are seen as very ephemeral. They're there and they're gone.
You bring up the fall in love point.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask this question earlier.
So the story revolves around Wu Cuiyuan and Lu Zongzhen. They meet. The story tells us they fall in love. He proposes that she become his concubine, and then the city
starts working
again, and then it all falls apart.
They sort of get separated by people,
and they disappear. And then I think he asks for her number when she starts crying, and he doesn't get it. There's something like it just kind of the city gets in the way. Right. So let me ask you something. Do you think they really fell in love?
They actually fell in love. I'm going to say no.
No?
I'm going to say no.
I think yes.
That's shocking that you would disagree with me on a recorded episode of our podcast. I don't think so, because I think what's integral to the story is the fact that things don't last. And some of her other works where she writes about love, she writes about it in a very different way. Like Love in a Fallen City, for example, they do fall in love and they attempt to stay together, whereas in here, it's there and it's gone. And so, for me, the story doesn't work if she's describing love as something real, attraction perhaps, something ephemeral I can see happening, but not love.
So I think what we're disagreeing over is the definition of love. I would suggest
that's a different podcast.
That's yeah. Explains why we've been in such a long relationship, doesn't it? The definition of love for Zhang Ailing, I think, is ephemeral. I think what she's saying here is that love is necessarily ephemeral. It's like a streetcar passing through. It just kind of, you can stay on it for a long time, or you might just stay on it for a short time. But we don't get that choice as far as love is concerned. And I think this is a genuine love in terms of how Zhang Ailing defines and constructs love. If you look back at Ban Chengyuan, Fate, half a lifetime's worth of fate, I think is what it's called. You know, love is not something that really happens very well in Zhang Ailing. Most of her stories are about love not working, or long-term love. It's only an ephemeral love that we ever have.
Right, and I think that, I guess one of my final thoughts then would be that takes us right back to this notion of an urban Chinese fiction, because this is how someone who grows up in a place where relationships are here and gone in an instant might think of love. it's something that might be real, but only in a matter of minutes.
If I could suggest, it's a very modern understanding of love. It's a very urban understanding of love.
It's and you mentioned the word, you didn't say control, but something along those lines. Do we even have control? Do you just sort of bump into someone and, oh, there it is? Don't sing the song. But, or do you actually go, I said don't even dance to the song, just leave it alone. Or do you seek it out? And the idea of free love, incidentally, was very much a part of the May 4th movement.
Yeah, and it's 1930s. It's big in China at this
time. What's
time.
key is the notion that you choose. And in here, there's no choice. You just happen to get thrown together in the city.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So Wu Zongzhen, he is sort of forced into his first marriage, and he's not really happy about it. And now he's going to try and engage in some sort of concubine thing, which is
making up his losses.
Yeah, it's an incredibly weird moment, because the whole thing about this story is how modern everything is. But the fact that he's proposing a concubine is an incredibly kind of like old
classical
thing. And there's an interesting thing, a sort of traditional Chinese cultural token reference that bookends this story. There's a beggar from Shandong. The narrator starts out as the tram driver, but immediately moves on to this beggar from Shandong. And he's singing this traditional Chinese song that's been sung for generation after generation, the story says. And it's, how sad I am, no money do I have. And the story offers us a chance to have this May 4th critique, to talk about traditional China, to talk about what Chineseness means. But then it immediately moves on. And it comes back to that at the end, but it just kind of doesn't care. The narrative does not care about Chineseness and this sort of traditional Chinese thing.
Or what this beggar, who could be very easy to talk about as someone cast into the city by an unjust system.
If this were May 4th literature, that would be what would happen. We would just focus on the beggar. The narrative would just all be about how tough things are for the beggar. But we don't. We just kind of hover over him, and then we immediately move on to these modern people in the streetcar.
Right.
So the story offers us the chance to have this traditional May 4th critique. And then it just says, no, I'm not going to do that.
It includes everything in the tram car, and then just moves on. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end it.
That's a good place to end it, yeah.
How sad I am. No money do I have.
Well, we're gonna get so rich from these recordings. I mean, it's just a matter of time. So don't be sad, Lee.
Thank you all for listening to us. Thank you
and
watching us. And hopefully you're not too stunned by how ugly we are.
Yeah, that we can hope anyway.
Anyways, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, sort of.